All right, let's jump right into it. Today we're diving deep into a topic that's, well, let's face it, it's a bit of a mainstay in the UPSC syllabus.
Yeah.
The challenges facing children,
Right.
not just here in India, but globally. And, for our listeners out there, all you UPSC aspirants, this is the kind of deep dive that's really going to equip you
For sure.
with the insights you need to tackle this issue head-on in your mains exam.
Absolutely.
Or maybe even snag a few points in the prelims.
It's a topic that really, cuts across so many different areas, right?
Oh,
You
yeah.
got social justice, governance, international relations,
Oh, for sure.
even environmental issues, like a UPSC goldmine.
It is.
Yeah.
And the material we're diving into today is top-notch.
Yeah.
You've got the latest UNICEF report, and then to really bring it home, those hard-hitting articles from down to earth.
Really paints a comprehensive picture.
Absolutely. So we're going to uncover some pretty alarming statistics, but more importantly, we're going to analyze how these issues interconnect, how global trends impact India, and what it all means for, future policymakers like you guys listening.
You got it.
So, are you ready to go beyond the headlines?
I am. Let's do it.
All right. Now, the UNICEF report, it starts off with 3 major global crises:
Right.
conflict, debt, and climate change.
Right.
And of course, each one of these is having a pretty disproportionate impact on children.
Absolutely.
Okay, so conflict. We all see those headlines, right?
Mhm.
But what does this actually look like for children on the ground? Like, what's the reality?
Well, the report highlights something pretty striking.
Yeah.
Over 473 million children.
Wow,
That's more than 1 in 6 globally
Right.
living in active conflict zones.
that's a huge number.
It is. And to put it in perspective, that's almost double the proportion from the 1990s.
That's staggering.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, beyond the immediate danger, right? What are the long-term consequences for these kids? I mean, growing up amidst violence like that.
It's tough to even imagine, right?
Yeah.
Being forced to flee your home, witnessing unimaginable horrors, facing hunger, disease,
Oh, it's just
this kind of prolonged exposure to conflict, it can lead to, a generation scarred by trauma,
Yeah.
facing significant barriers to education, to healthcare.
And just a stable future.
Exactly, a stable future.
It's like a recipe for a lost generation, really.
It really is.
And, while India, thankfully, isn't a conflict zone itself,
Right.
I can't help but wonder how these global conflicts indirectly impact, Indian children.
That's a great point, and it's something the UPSC examiners love to see, that ability to connect those global dots,
Right?
Think about things like refugee crises, economic shocks,
Oh, yeah.
ripple effects on global trade and development.
Mm.
These issues might not be on Indian soil, but their impact, it can definitely be felt here.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so moving on from conflict,
Okay.
UNICEF report, it also highlights this crushing burden of debt on developing nations.
Mm-hmm.
So what's the connection there to children's well-being?
Well, it boils down to resources, right?
Right. Yeah.
Nearly 400 million children live in countries that are, crippled by debt.
Wow.
And that translates to limited funding for essential services, things like education and healthcare.
It's like this vicious cycle, right?
Exactly.
Debt leads to underinvestment in children, which then, of course, hampers a country's long-term development.
Exactly. It's a vicious cycle.
All right, so we've got conflict, we've got debt, 2 major global crises
Mhm.
with, far-reaching consequences.
Right.
And then, of course, there's climate change, which, as the report says, is only getting worse.
And it's children who are bearing the brunt of it.
Yeah.
What's really alarming is that only a tiny fraction
Right.
of global climate finance,
Yeah.
a mere 2.4% to be exact,
That
is directed towards initiatives that specifically benefit children.
That's shocking. I mean, considering how, climate disasters are becoming more frequent, more intense, shouldn't children be at the forefront of, climate action?
They absolutely should.
Right.
But the reality is the funding for these child-centric climate resilience initiatives, it's severely lacking.
Wow.
And that means that the systems that are meant to protect and support children during these disasters, droughts, floods, you name it,
Yeah.
they're just, they're woefully underprepared.
Okay, so we've got conflict, debt, and climate change.
Right.
This triple threat
Yeah.
really impacting children the hardest.
Mm-hmm.
But then the UNICEF report, it throws in another layer of complexity,
Yeah.
digital divide.
Right.
So how does that fit in with all of this?
It's a bit of a paradox. On one hand, you've got digital public infrastructure, or DPI,
Right.
and it has this incredible potential to revolutionize how governments deliver vital services to children.
Oh, I see.
Think about telehealth, online education,
Hmm.
even targeted social welfare programs.
Mm.
It's a really powerful tool for inclusion and empowerment.
Yeah, I mean, DPI could really be a game changer, but then there's this, well, this harsh reality of the digital divide.
Right. And sadly, while young people in high-income countries have almost universal internet access,
Yeah.
millions of children, especially in low-income countries, are being left behind.
Hmm.
And the gender dimension of this is even more concerning.
The report specifically mentions that 9 out of 10 adolescent girls in low-income countries are offline.
It's a staggering statistic.
It is. I mean, what does that mean for their future in a world that's, increasingly reliant on technology?
It raises serious concerns about equity and opportunity, right?
Yeah.
This digital divide, it not only limits access to information and education,
Of course.
but it also perpetuates existing inequalities, particularly for girls.
Okay, so we've unpacked these major global challenges.
Mhm.
But, as UPSC aspirants, it's crucial to bring this home.
Right. Absolutely.
And that's where those DTE articles you've shared come in.
They really delve into those specific challenges facing children in India,
Right.
linking global trends with those local realities.
And that's the kind of analysis those UPSC examiners are looking for, right?
Yeah,
For example, one article mentions that India ranks 26th in the Children's Climate Risk Index.
yeah, that's a significant ranking.
It is, but what does it actually tell us?
Well, it tells us that Indian children are becoming increasingly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change.
I see.
We're talking extreme heat waves, devastating floods,
Right.
rising sea levels.
All right.
Think about the recent floods in Kerala or the heat waves in Rajasthan.
Oh, for sure.
These events, they're becoming more frequent, more intense, and children are disproportionately affected.
So it's not just about knowing that India ranks 26th.
Right.
It's about understanding what that ranking means in terms of real-world impact,
Exactly.
policy implications.
Yeah. And that's where the DTE articles go deeper, right?
Yeah.
They don't just present statistics.
Right.
They explore those underlying causes and the cascading effects of these challenges on children's lives.
So let's dive into those India-specific challenges then.
Okay.
What really stood out to you in your reading?
Well, the first thing that struck me was just the sheer breadth of issues covered.
Wow.
We're talking about climate change, of course,
Yeah.
but also child trafficking, juvenile crime, child marriage,
Mm-hmm.
gender inequality, the plight of disadvantaged children, even the implications of population growth.
It's a lot.
It's a complex and interconnected landscape, really.
It is, and it's easy to feel overwhelmed, by just how big these challenges are. But I think that's where the DPE articles are really valuable. They break down these complex issues into more digestible pieces,
Maybe.
providing data, analysis,
Mm-hmm.
and importantly, potential solutions.
Exactly. And that's what we'll be exploring in the next part of our deep dive.
Stay tuned, folks. We'll be right back to delve into those solutions and the way forward.
Welcome back. So far we've really laid out some pretty sobering realities
Yeah.
facing children,
Uh-huh.
globally and here in India.
Right.
But let's shift gears a bit now, okay?
Okay.
What I found fascinating is that the DTE articles, they don't just dwell on the problems, they actually shed some light on solutions,
All right.
potential interventions.
Right.
And for a UPSC aspirant, this is where things get really interesting, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. I mean, it's not enough to just diagnose the problem, right? We need to understand what's being done, what's working, what's not, and where there's room for improvement.
Right. That's the kind of critical analysis that can really make your mains answer stand out,
For sure, for sure. Okay, so let's take an example, all right? The Sakshman Kanwadi and Poshan 2.0 scheme.
Okay.
This revamped version of the Integrated Child Development Services Program.
Right.
It's aimed at tackling malnutrition, promoting early childhood development.
It's a massive scheme.
It is
a wide reach,
huge, yeah.
covering millions of children across the country.
So the big question is it actually effective?
That's the key question, isn't it?
It is, yeah. So how do we even begin to analyze something like Poshan 2.0? Where do we start?
Well, the DTE articles give us some good starting points, I think.
Oh,
They highlight the scheme's strengths, like its focus on that holistic development,
okay.
including nutrition, healthcare, early childhood education.
Yeah.
They also acknowledge the progress that's been made in reducing malnutrition rates
That's good.
and improving access to essential services.
That's encouraging, for sure.
Yeah.
But I'm guessing there are also, challenges, right?
Of course, of course.
Limitations to think about.
No scheme is perfect, right?
Right.
And Poshan 2.0 is no exception.
Okay.
The articles point out issues like, well, inadequate infrastructure in certain areas, gaps in service delivery,
Yeah.
the need for more robust monitoring and evaluation, that kind of thing.
Right. So definitely room for improvement there.
Yeah.
And this is where the real opportunity lies, I think, for you, as a future policymaker.
Right.
Imagine you're tasked with strengthening Poshan 2.0. What kind of solutions would you propose?
Ooh, that's a good challenge.
It is.
Well, first, I'd probably focus on addressing those implementation challenges we just talked about, right? Maybe increase budgetary allocations to improve infrastructure, provide better training for Anganwadi workers.
Yeah, that makes sense.
You could also think about leveraging technology,
Okay.
create more efficient monitoring systems,
Right.
making sure that those benefits are actually reaching the people who need them most.
And maybe even involve communities more directly.
Exactly. Empowering local communities to really take ownership of Poshan 2.0.
Yeah.
I think that could significantly enhance its effectiveness.
Those are some great points. And it's a perfect example of the kind of analytical thinking the UPSC examiners love to see, It's not just about knowing the name of the scheme. It's about understanding those complexities, the strengths, the weaknesses, and most importantly, how it can be improved.
Exactly. And that same approach applies to all these challenges we've been talking about.
Right.
Take child trafficking, for instance.
Okay.
The DTE articles, they highlight the importance of, strengthening law enforcement, but they also emphasize the need to address those root causes.
It was par.
Things like poverty, lack of opportunities.
Of course.
So you might need to invest in education skills training,
Right.
creating sustainable livelihood options for those vulnerable families.
It's about tackling the problem from multiple angles, right?
But it's
combining those punitive measures with preventative strategies and those long-term solutions.
Absolutely. And what about juvenile crime?
Yeah.
The article suggests that, those purely punitive approaches, they're just not effective.
Right.
They're advocating for a more rehabilitative approach,
Interesting.
focusing on counseling, education, social reintegration programs, that kind of thing.
It's about seeing those young offenders not as criminals,
Right.
but as individuals who need support and guidance.
Exactly, to help them turn their lives around.
Okay. And then there's child marriage.
Yeah.
The DTE articles, they talk about the importance of challenging those harmful social norms and empowering girls through education and economic opportunities.
And that brings us back to the digital divide.
It does.
We talked about the potential of DPI,
Right.
but how do we actually ensure that it benefits all children, especially girls from those marginalized communities?
That's a big one.
It is, and it requires a multi-pronged approach,
Okay.
We need to invest in digital infrastructure, yes, but also focus on digital literacy programs,
Right.
particularly for girls and women.
Yeah.
We need to create content that's relevant, accessible,
Correct.
and ensure that technology is used in a way that actually promotes gender equality and social inclusion.
And what about legislation? Those policy frameworks that protect children in the digital space.
Absolutely crucial. We need those robust laws to prevent online exploitation, abuse, and to make sure that children's rights are protected in that online world.
All right, so from strengthening existing schemes like Poshan 2.0 to addressing those systemic issues like poverty and gender inequality, it's clear that solutions require a multifaceted approach.
They do, and a willingness to innovate,
Oh, interesting.
The DTE articles highlight some really promising initiatives.
Oh, like what?
Well, things like using technology to improve service delivery, empowering those communities, fostering public-private partnerships to mobilize resources.
That is smart.
Those are just a few examples, right, of how we can think outside the box to create a better future for India's children.
It's inspiring to see that there are people out there working on these solutions, testing those new approaches, advocating for change.
It is.
But ultimately, it's up to the next generation of policymakers like you guys listening.
Right.
To take these ideas and turn them into action.
So, are you ready for that challenge?
I think that's a question best answered in part 3 of this deep dive.
What do you say we explore that together after a short break?
Wow, we've covered a lot in this deep dive, haven't we? From those global crises to the challenges here in India.
It's a complex landscape, for sure.
It is. But you know what's really stood out to me from these DTE articles?
What's that?
There's this real sense of hope, like woven throughout.
Oh, I agree.
Like there are solutions out there. People are working hard to make things better, to create change, you know?
Yeah, testing new approaches.
And that's where you come in, right? As future policymakers,
That's us.
you guys are the ones who will be shaping those policies,
Right.
allocating resources, making those, well, sometimes those tough decisions.
It's a big responsibility.
It is, but it's also an incredible opportunity, right?
Absolutely.
So let's break this down for our listeners.
Right.
What are the key takeaways? What do they absolutely need to remember?
Yeah.
What should they be carrying with them into that UPSC exam hall?
All right, I like it.
Okay, takeaway number 1, interconnectedness. These challenges we've talked about, they don't exist in a vacuum.
Right. But don't.
Poverty fuels child labor. Climate change makes those inequalities even worse. And a lack of education limits opportunities, especially for girls.
It's a web.
It is, you can't solve one problem without addressing the others.
You got it.
Takeaway number 2, and this is a big one, the need for a holistic approach to child welfare.
Yes, absolutely.
We need systems that address, all those different needs that children have, not just programs that work in isolation.
Think long-term,
Right.
sustainably, and always, always put those best interests of the child first, right?
Absolutely, at the heart of every policy decision.
At the heart.
And finally, takeaway number 3, and this is the most important one,
All right, let's hear it.
the power of you. You guys, as future policymakers, you have the potential to make a real difference,
We do.
a tangible difference in the lives of children.
Stay informed.
Yeah,
Stay engaged.
Yes.
And never, ever be afraid to challenge the status quo.
I love that.
Be bold, be innovative, and be that voice for those who often go unheard, right?
Absolutely. Now, before we wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with a question,
Okay, shoot.
a thought-provoking one, all right? Imagine you're sitting in that UPSC interview chair,
Okay.
and the panel throws this at you.
Uh-oh.
India is projected to have the largest youth population in the world by 2030. What does this mean for the country's future?
Whoa, that's a big one.
It is,
Yeah.
right. It really makes you think about the challenges and the opportunities.
For sure, that's a question that really cuts to the core of everything we've been talking about.
Because on one hand, you've got this incredible demographic dividend, right?
Yeah.
This potential for a young, vibrant workforce.
Driving economic growth, innovation.
Exactly. But on the other hand, there's this very real risk that all that potential could be wasted, right?
Right. If we don't address those challenges we've been discussing.
If we don't invest in our children, if we don't equip them with the education, the skills, the opportunities they need.
It's a high-stakes scenario for sure.
It is, if we get this right, India's future is bright.
Absolutely.
But if we fail to meet their needs, if we let these challenges fester, well, we risk creating a generation that's left behind,
Facing unemployment, social unrest, a future that's far from that shining India we all dream of.
It's a stark choice,
It is.
and it's a choice that rests in your hands,
In the hands of those future policymakers.
So, to our listeners out there, all you aspiring policymakers, remember this. The well-being of our children is the well-being of our nation.
That's right.
Invest in them, nurture their potential, and let's create a world where every child has a chance to flourish.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
And that's a wrap on this deep dive into the world of children in crisis.
We hope you found it insightful
Thought-provoking.
and maybe even a little inspiring.
Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share the deep dive with your fellow UPSC aspirants, all right? And a huge thanks to Down to Earth, the source for today's episode.
Definitely check them out for more in-depth coverage of these crucial issues.
Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep striving to make a difference.